Jalen, a 14-year-old black boy, sits at his desk, his hand raised to answer a question. He is bright, confident, and excels academically despite the challenges that follow him in the classroom. Mrs. Peters, strictly looking at the class. Jalen, yes. What do you think? Jalen, calm, clear. I believe that every action has consequences, even the smallest ones, and those actions shape who we become. It's like the ripple effect in a pond, just bigger. Mrs. Peters eyes him for a moment, skeptical. She nods but doesn't seem impressed. Mrs. Peters, with an edge, dismissive. Yes, but maybe a little less poetic next time, Jalen. Your classmates might not follow. Jalen lowers his hand, a slight frown forming. He's used to this. His peers snicker quietly, not understanding the weight of the moment. But Jalen holds his ground, his expression calm, though inside, there's a sting. Jalen sits at his desk, looking over his homework. He's focused, his father's words echoing in his mind. Mr. Mitchell, V.O., gentle but firm from a past conversation. You have to rise above it, son. You're not just fighting for yourself, you're fighting for all of us. Jalen's eyes flicker, the weight of his father's advice mixing with the weariness of his day. He stands and walks over to the window, looking out at the night sky. His reflection is faint in the glass. He looks tired. Jalen, to himself softly, why does it always feel like I have to prove myself? Jalen is sitting in his seat waiting for Mrs. Peters to begin the class. As the bell rings, she begins the lesson. She points to Jalen without warning. Mrs. Peters. Jalen, explain why the Civil War is relevant today. Jalen's voice is calm, yet there's a slight tremor in his tone, like a warning bell ringing in his head. He speaks slowly, carefully. Jalen, it's relevant because it's about power. Who holds it, who decides how it's used, and who's denied it. It's still happening. Every day. The room goes silent. Mrs. Peters gives a tight smile that doesn't reach her eyes. Mrs. Peters, cutting him off. Interesting opinion. But this isn't the time for social commentary, Jalen. Let's stick to the facts, please. Jalen opens his mouth, but a glance from Mrs. Peters tells him to stay silent. He feels a wave of frustration, but he holds his tongue. The tension in the room is palpable. Jalen walks through the hallway trying to blend into the background. The whispers and stares are hard to avoid. He walks past his classmates, who are laughing and chatting with one another. A group of students gives him a sideways glance, one of them snickering behind their hands. Student 1, whispering loud enough for Jalen to hear. Why is he always acting so serious? Student 2, mocking, quietly. Yeah, like he's better than us or something. Jalen looks down at his feet, the sting of their words lingering. He tries to shake it off, but it sits in his chest, a reminder of the unspoken biases that follow him everywhere. Jalen is sitting on the couch, his head in his hands. Mr. Mitchell enters the room and immediately notices the change in his son's demeanor. Mr. Mitchell, concerned. What's wrong, son? Jalen, shaking his head, voice cracking. It's like nothing I do is enough. She just keeps finding ways to make me feel like I don't belong. Mr. Mitchell sits beside him, placing a hand on his shoulder. He looks at his son, his expression a mix of sadness and understanding. Mr. Mitchell softly. I know it hurts, Jalen, but listen to me, all right? Your worth isn't determined by how they see you. It's determined by what you know about yourself and what you stand for. Jalen, quietly, almost to himself. But I don't know if I can keep fighting it, Dad. Every time I think I'm doing well. She finds a way to remind me I'm just different. Mr. Mitchell, firm, looking him in the eyes. That's exactly what they want you to believe. But you can rise above it, son. You come from a long line of fighters, and your strength is in your voice. Don't let anyone take that from you. Jalen's presentation on influential historical figures is set up. He steps up to the front of the class, ready to speak. Mrs. Peters is already preparing to critique him. As Jalen begins, she interrupts him. Mrs. Peters, loudly cutting him off. Jalen, I'm not sure you did enough research for this. You're rushing through it. I'll expect you to stay after class and redo this. Jalen's eyes widen in disbelief. His heart races, but he stands tall, taking a deep breath. Jalen, loudly, with resolve. I did my work. I've earned the right to be heard, and I won't let you silence me anymore. The class falls silent. Mrs. Peters's face turns red, her frustration clear. Jalen stands taller, his voice unwavering as he continues. Jalen, with power. You don't get to define who I am or how hard I work. I'm not just a student in your class. I'm a person with dreams that matter. Jalen sits with his father, Mr. Mitchell. The principal, Mrs. Jennings, is seated across from them, her arms crossed. Mrs. Peters stands by the door, visibly upset. Mrs. Jennings, calm but firm. We've received multiple complaints about the tension between you two. We need to understand what happened, Jalen. Jalen looks at his father, who gives him a nod. He looks back at Mrs. Jennings, his voice steady but full of emotion. Jalen, resolute. It's not just about a misunderstanding. It's about a pattern. Every time I try to excel, she finds a way to make me feel small. She calls it constructive criticism, but it's really just racism dressed up as authority. Mrs. Peters shifts uncomfortably, her eyes narrowing. Mrs. Peters, defensively, that's not true. I've always treated my students fairly. Jalen's just being sensitive. Jalen, loudly cutting her off. My dad's name is Mr. Mitchell. Maybe you remember him. He's the man who stood up to you years ago when you treated me like this before. The room goes still. Mrs. Peters visibly recoils, her face draining of color. The mention of Mr. Mitchell's name sends a wave of discomfort through her. She knows the history behind the name. She knows what that man stands for. The room is heavy with silence. Jalen's words hang in the air like a thick fog, and Mrs. Peters struggles to maintain her composure. She shifts her weight, trying to regain control of the conversation, but her eyes are wide, her lips pressed, together in a thin line. Mrs. Peters, shakily, defensive. I don't know what your father told you, Jalen, but I've always tried to be fair with all of my students. You're making this into something it's not. Jalen's heart pounds in his chest, but he stands firm, refusing to back down. His father's presence beside him is a quiet anchor, a reminder of the strength he's inherited. He feels a rush of emotion, his voice rising with each word. Jalen, forcefully standing taller. No, it's exactly what it is. You've been treating me differently ever since I walked into your classroom. You've dismissed my opinions, ignored my hard work, and criticized me for things that didn't even make sense. But you don't do that to everyone. You pick me out because of the color of my skin, and you've been doing it for too long. Mrs. Peters flinches, as if Jalen's words have struck her hard. The principal, Mrs. Jennings, looks between the two, clearly uncomfortable but also recognizing the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Jennings, softly, to Mrs. Peters. Perhaps we need to take a step back and reassess how we're handling things here. Jalen, I want you to know that we're listening. Your voice matters. Jalen nods, feeling a mixture of relief and anger. He's been waiting for someone to say that, but the weight of the moment still sits heavily on him. Mrs. Peters, however, refuses to relent. She's been exposed and her pride won't let her give in so easily. Mrs. Peters, coldly, eyes narrowing at Jalen. This is ridiculous. You're just making accusations because you didn't get your way. I've been teaching for over 30 years, and I've never had a problem with any of my students like this. The tension thickens, and for a moment it feels like the room is about to snap. But then Mr. Mitchell stands up, his presence commanding the attention of everyone in the room. He walks over to Jalen, placing a hand on his son's shoulder with quiet pride. Mr. Mitchell, calmly but with authority. You don't get to dismiss him like that. My son's not just making accusations. He's standing up for himself because no one else will. Mrs. Peters looks away, her face flushed with anger and shame. The principal notices, her brows furrowing as she finally begins to understand the depth of the problem. Mrs. Peters's cold facade begins to crack, revealing the discomfort she's tried to suppress. Mrs. Jennings, sighing to Mrs. Peters, We're going to need a thorough investigation into this, Mrs. Peters. This cannot be ignored. Jalen takes a deep breath, his body still tense, but now there's a sense of victory in his heart. The weight of the years of mistreatment begins to lift, just slightly. His voice no longer shakes. It's steady, powerful, as he turns to look at his father. Jalen, to his father, quietly. I did it, Dad. I finally stood up. Mr. Mitchell smiles at his son, the pride in his eyes unmistakable. Mr. Mitchell, softly, firmly. You didn't just stand up for yourself, Jalen. You stood up for all of us. The scene shifts from the tense atmosphere of the principal's office to the quiet triumph of Jalen's words. For the first time, he feels like the weight of the world isn't on his shoulders alone. His father's legacy of strength and resilience has passed down to him, and he's ready to carry it forward. The days following the confrontation have been tense, but a shift is palpable in the school. Teachers are more aware, and students have begun to pay attention. Jalen walks into the classroom, his head held higher than before. Mrs. Peters stands at the front, visibly nervous but trying to maintain her usual stern demeanor. Her eyes dart nervously toward Jalen, but she doesn't say a word. For the first time, Jalen doesn't feel the weight of her judgment. He feels free. As the class begins, Jalen raises his hand, ready to participate. He's no longer afraid of being ignored or belittled. Mrs. Peters hesitates for a moment before calling on him, and when she does, Jalen's response is measured, confident, and full of conviction. Jalen, firmly. The past shapes the present. It's not just history, it's still happening right here, right now. Every day, we have to challenge it, speak out against it, or we let it continue. Mrs. Peters doesn't respond immediately. She stands there, her lips pressed together, perhaps reconsidering the sharpness of her previous approach. For the first time, Jalen feels like he's not just answering a question, he's making a statement. Jalen walks down the hallway, a few of his classmates now nodding at him as he passes by. There's a new respect in their eyes, a recognition of his courage. He feels the shift, even if it's subtle. The whispers and stares aren't gone completely, but there's a difference. People are starting to listen. He walks past a group of students who once laughed behind his back. This time they don't whisper. One of them, a girl named Maya, looks at him with a genuine smile. Maya, softly but sincerely, Hey Jalen, I just wanted to say, I'm sorry for not standing up sooner. Jalen looks at her, a small but genuine smile tugging at his lips. He nods, acknowledging her apology, but he doesn't need it to feel validated. His worth isn't in their approval, it's in himself. Jalen, quietly. It's all right, Maya. We all have our moments. But we can all do better. As Jalen walks away, his steps are lighter, the burden of isolation and doubt slowly dissipating. He knows the fight is far from over, but he also knows that he's not alone in it anymore. He's found his voice and he'll never let it go again. The entire school is gathered in the auditorium for an assembly. The air is thick with anticipation. Students file in, chatting quietly, though there's an undercurrent of nervous energy. The principal, Mrs. Jennings, stands at the podium, a smile stretched across her face, but there's a certain tension in her eyes. She gestures to the crowd, signaling for the students to quiet down. Mrs. Jennings, with a measured tone, addressing the crowd. Welcome, everyone. Today is a special day, and we're here to have an important conversation. The chatter dies down, and the room falls into silence. Mrs. Jennings clears her throat, her eyes scanning the audience. Mrs. Jennings, continuing. We've recently had some important discussions about inclusivity, respect, and the way we treat each other as a community. We all know that sometimes we fall short of those values, but today we're going to do better. She pauses, letting the weight of her words hang in the air. She turns slightly, motioning to the side, where Jalen stands, looking confident and poised as though ready to take on the world. He steps forward, his footsteps echoing in the quiet auditorium. The students look at him curiously, and a few whisper to one another. Jalen takes a deep breath before he steps up to the microphone. Jalen, calmly but with quiet power. Hi, everyone. My name is Jalen Mitchell. Some of you might know me, some of you might not. But I'm here today because something happened to me that shouldn't have. I was treated differently. I was overlooked, ignored, and humiliated. And it hurt. It hurt because I worked harder than anyone else to be the best I could be, only to find that my best wasn't enough because of the color of my skin. There's a murmur in the audience as Jalen's words sink in. He can feel their eyes on him, some full of curiosity, others full of guilt. But he keeps going, his voice steady and strong. Jalen, continuing, his voice growing in strength. It's not just about me, though. It's about all of us. We're all part of this school, this community. And if we don't speak up when we see someone being treated unfairly, then we're just as guilty. We have to do better. We have to stand up for each other, especially when the world tries to tear us down. Jalen looks directly at Mrs. Peters, who is sitting near the back of the auditorium, her face flushed with discomfort. She avoids his gaze, but Jalen isn't afraid anymore. His eyes stay steady as he speaks. Jalen, firmly with resolve, I want to thank my dad, Mr. Mitchell, because he taught me to always stand tall and be proud of who I am. And I want to remind everyone here today that we all deserve that respect. Every single one of us. The room is dead silent for a moment. Then slowly, a few students begin to clap. The sound builds, and soon the entire auditorium is applauding, some standing to their feet. Jalen's heart races, but he stands tall, soaking in the moment. Knowing this is just the beginning. This is his stand, and it's not just for him, it's for everyone. Jalen walks through the hallway after the assembly, his head held high. He feels different now, like a weight has been lifted. The whispers aren't gone, but there's a sense of change in the air. A girl from his class, Kira, approaches him as he walks toward his locker. She looks at him, her eyes thoughtful. Kiara, hesitantly, but with sincerity. Jalen, I just wanted to say that was really powerful. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, and I didn't realize. Jalen stops, looking at her with a soft smile. His shoulders relax as he leans against the lockers, the tension of the past week slowly melting away. Jalen gratefully, thank you, Kira. I know it's not easy to talk about, but the more we speak up, the more we can change things. Kiara, nodding with newfound respect. You're right. I'm sorry for not seeing it before, but I see it now. I won't be quiet about it anymore. Jalen gives her a small smile, knowing that this moment, this conversation, is part of the larger shift in the school. More people are beginning to listen. More people are beginning to understand. It feels like a victory. Mrs. Jennings sits at her desk reviewing a pile of reports, but her mind is elsewhere. She's just watched Jalen's speech, and the impact it's had on the students is undeniable. She sighs, looking up from her work as the door opens. It's Mrs. Peters standing hesitantly in the doorway. She's a far cry from the confident, stern teacher Jalen had once faced. Now she's weary, her expression full of guilt and regret. Mrs. Peters, quietly with a heavy heart. I heard what Jalen said today, and I've been thinking about everything. I was wrong. Mrs. Jennings looks up at her, her expression softening. She sets down the report, giving Mrs. Peters a moment to continue. Mrs. Peters pauses, her voice breaking slightly. I treated him unfairly. And it's not just Jalen. It's all the students I've failed to see. I've been blind to the way I've let my biases shape my behavior. Mrs. Jennings, gently but firmly. It's important that you acknowledge this, Mrs. Peters. But it's more important that you make the change. It's not enough to just feel regret. You have to actively do better. We all do. Mrs. Peters nods, a tear slipping down her cheek. She wipes it away quickly, but it's a sign of the internal struggle she's facing. She's aware of the long road ahead, but she knows it's a road that must be walked. Mrs. Peters, softly but with conviction. I will. I promise. Jalen sits outside during lunch. His friends gathered around him, but there's something different about the way they talk to him now. Maya, Kira, and a few others ask him questions about his life, about his dreams. They listen, not just to his words, but to his story. For the first time in a long while, Jalen feels like he truly belongs. Maya, playfully, yet sincerely. So, Jalen Mitchell, the future lawyer, you've got the speech down already. Jalen, laughing softly, I guess I'm just getting started. He looks around at his friends, at the change that's happening in the school, and at the way his life is beginning to shift. He's not just fighting for his voice anymore. He's fighting for all of them. And with his dad's strength and his own courage, he knows that they can make a difference. Jalen's journey is far from over, but with every step he's becoming more of the leader he's destined to be. The community he once felt distant from is now starting to hear him, see him, and respect him. And as the days go by, he knows that the ripple effect of his actions will carry on far beyond the walls of this school. Jalen's breath hitches as he walks to the front of the class. Mrs. Peters has just called on him to present his class project, something he spent weeks working on. His hands tremble, but he stands tall, focusing on the details he knows so well. He clears his throat and begins to speak. Jalen, softly. Good morning, everyone. My project is about leaders who fought for equality and justice, like Nelson Mandela and Harriet Tubman. They weren't just leaders because of what they did, but because of the sacrifices they made to create a better world for people like me. Mrs. Peters, standing at the side of the room, watches with a cold expression. Her arms are crossed, tightly, and she taps her foot impatiently. Mrs. Peters, interrupting, sharp. Jalen, are you sure you did all this yourself? I see a lot of big names here. Are you sure you didn't just copy from the internet like you usually do? Jalen freezes. The class goes silent. He can feel every eye on him, some waiting, others watching with quiet curiosity. Mrs. Peters' words sting like a slap, but he fights to keep his composure. Jalen, his voice steadier now, but his hands are clenched. I researched every part of this project. I spent hours going through books and articles. These people inspired me. Mrs. Peters, cutting him off. Let's be honest, Jalen. You don't belong up here with this kind of work. Other students are actually working harder than you. Maybe you should sit down and let someone else take over. The room grows still, and Jalen's heart races in his chest. He can feel the heat in his face, the anger rising. He wants to say something, to shout, but his mind is spinning, trying to make sense of what just happened. Jalen, his voice breaking through louder now. I did the work. All of it. I deserve to be here just like anyone else. Mrs. Peters stares at him, her face hardening. The silence in the room feels suffocating. Mrs. Peters, raising her voice, sneering. You're not the only one who works hard. Maybe, if you put your energy into behaving, you wouldn't need to be making excuses for your lack of effort. Jalen stands there for a long moment, his mind whirling with the weight of the situation. His classmates shift uncomfortably in their seats. Some look at him with sympathy, others with confusion. But all of them are witnessing the painful truth of what he's been dealing with. Jalen, finally, with strength. This isn't about behavior. This is about you treating me differently because of who I am. You've been doing it since the first day of class. The words hang in the air. Mrs. Peters' face flushes red. But before she can respond, Jalen steps back, his hands still shaking. He walks to his seat, the class too quiet, the weight of his words pressing down on him. Mrs. Peters, after a long pause but with a sneer, Sit down, Jalen. Jalen sits, but his mind is racing, his chest tight with emotion. For the first time he's spoken up, not just for himself but for everything he's been quietly enduring. The bell rings a moment later, signaling the end of class. Jalen gathers his things quickly, feeling the stares of his classmates on him. He wants to disappear, to escape the moment, but instead, he walks out the door with his head held high. As Jalen exits the classroom, his heart still pounds, and his thoughts are in turmoil. Was that enough? Was that even the right thing to do? But something inside him feels different now. The weight of the silence he's carried for so long is starting to lift, and he realizes that his voice is more powerful than he ever knew. The next day, the school buzzes with gossip. Whispers echo through the halls about Jalen's confrontation with Mrs. Peters. Some students talk behind his back. Others avoid eye contact, unsure of how to act. But Jalen walks through the hallways with a quiet confidence that he hasn't felt before. At home that night, Jalen enters the kitchen to find his father, Mr. Mitchell, at the stove. The warmth of the food fills the room, but it's the warmth of his father's presence that settles Jalen's nerves. Mr. Mitchell doesn't immediately acknowledge him, but Jalen can see the small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Mr. Mitchell hand without looking up softly. "You did good today, son." Jalen sits at the kitchen table, staring at the food in front of him but not really seeing it. He picks at the edges of his plate, his thoughts still swirling. Jalen, hesitant, his voice low. "Dad, I don't know if I did the right thing. Mrs. Peters is still going to treat me the same way. And what if the other kids think I'm trouble for speaking up?" Mr. Mitchell places a hand on Jalen's shoulder, his grip firm and reassuring. Mr. Mitchell, calmly. "Son, what happened today wasn't about whether others think you're trouble. It was about standing up for your right to be seen, to be heard. People will always try to put you in a box, tell you who you are based on what they see on the outside, but that doesn't make it true." Jalen looks up at his father, his eyes searching for some reassurance. Jalen, softly, "But, Dad, what if I'm not enough? What if no matter how hard I work, it's never going to matter because of how I look?" Mr. Mitchell sighs, sitting down across from Jalen. His eyes lock onto his son's with a mixture of pride and sorrow. Mr. Mitchell, firmly, but with love. "You are enough. You've always been enough. What people like Mrs. Peters try to make, you believe, well, that's not the truth. The truth is that you have something they'll never be able to take from you. Your worth, your intelligence, your voice. And no matter how many times they try to silence you, you've got to stand tall and keep speaking up even when it feels like you're alone." Jalen nods slowly, absorbing his father's words. He doesn't say anything for a long moment, but the weight in his chest starts to lift. There's a fire inside him that hadn't been there before. Jalen, with newfound determination, quietly, "I'm not going to stay quiet anymore. I'll speak up. I'll make them see me." "Mr. Mitchell smiles, a proud grin spreading across his face. He stands and pats Jalen on the back. "Mr. Mitchell," with a teasing tone, "now you're talking. Your voice is the one thing they can't ignore, son. Just make sure you always speak with your heart." The next day, the parent-teacher conference arrives. Mr. Mitchell enters the school, his presence commanding and calm. He's been briefed on the situation, and he's ready. Jalen stands beside him, feeling a nervousness in his gut, but it's different this time. He isn't afraid. He stands tall, his shoulders back. In the principal's office, Mrs. Peters sits at the table, visibly tense. The usual authority she carried in the classroom has shifted. She's no longer the teacher in control. Now she's the one on the defensive. Mr. Mitchell, and taking a seat, his tone level. "We need to talk about how my son has been treated in your class." Mrs. Peters glances at Jalen, avoiding his eyes. She clears her throat, adjusting herself in her chair. Mrs. Peters gun with a forced neutral tone. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding. Jalen is a bright student, but he's been difficult in class. I've had to address some behavioral concerns, and I thought it was for his own good." Mr. Mitchell's eyes narrow slightly, but his voice remains calm. Mr. Mitchell, calmly, "There's no misunderstanding. It's clear that Jalen's been unfairly singled out because of his race, and I'm not going to let that slide." Jalen stands up a little straighter beside his father. The words are coming easily now, the years of frustration building up to this moment. Jalen, with quiet intensity, "She's been treating me like I'm not good enough for months. I've worked harder than anyone in that class, and she's never given me credit for it. She ignores my ideas, criticizes me when I speak, and makes me feel like I don't belong there." Mrs. Peters looks stunned for a moment, her face betraying her discomfort. She quickly glances away, avoiding Jalen's gaze. Jalen, his voice gaining strength. And it's not just in class, it's been happening in every moment. I'm not invisible, I'm not some problem, I'm a student who deserves respect. The room goes silent. Mr. Mitchell's gaze never leaves Mrs. Peters. He's not yelling, not raising his voice. But there's power in his stillness, in his unwavering focus on the truth. Mr. Mitchell, with authority. Jalen deserves better. This school deserves better. We all deserve better than what you've been offering. It's time to do something about it. Mrs. Peters squirms in her seat, her face flushed with shame. She mutters a half-hearted apology, but Jalen can tell that it's not sincere. The conversation continues with the principal taking notes, but Jalen knows that this moment is bigger than Mrs. Peters' apology. This is about breaking a cycle, about standing up and making a difference. As Jalen and his father leave the principal's office, a quiet satisfaction settles in. It's not over yet, but they've made their stand. For the first time, Jalen feels that his voice has power, real power, to change things. Later that night, Jalen stands in front of his mirror looking at his reflection. He doesn't see just a student. He sees a leader, someone capable of creating change. Jalen, to himself, quietly, this is just the beginning. The power of Jalen's growth, fueled by his father's teachings and his own courage, will ripple through the community. His fight isn't just about him. It's about everyone who's ever been silenced, overlooked, or dismissed because of who they are. Jalen is no longer just fighting for his place in the classroom. He's fighting for justice, for dignity, for the future. A week later, Jalen's courage continues to echo throughout the school. The news about his confrontation with Mrs. Peters spreads beyond the confines of the principal's office, and whispers turn into discussions. Students who had once avoided the topic of race now find themselves talking openly about the biases they've witnessed. Jalen's name becomes synonymous with standing up, not just for himself, but for everyone who's ever felt powerless in the face of prejudice. One afternoon, Jalen walks into the school gymnasium for an assembly. The walls are adorned with posters promoting inclusivity, diversity, and the need to confront racism in their community. It's clear that something has shifted. Jalen's eyes scan the room, meeting the gazes of his classmates. Some look at him with admiration, others with uncertainty. He can sense the change in the air, the way people are beginning to question their own biases, the way their voices are slowly starting to align with his. The principal steps up to the podium, her voice resonating through the speakers. Principal, with conviction. Today we are here to talk about the power of standing up. We are here to listen, learn, and grow. Jalen Mitchell has shown us that one voice can make a difference, that one person's courage can spark a movement. His actions have not only brought attention to the injustice in our school, but have started a conversation we can no longer ignore. Jalen's heart pounds in his chest as the room erupts in applause. He doesn't look for validation, but in this moment it's impossible not to feel the weight of his actions. His eyes find his father's, seated in the back, proud yet humble. Jalen's confidence grows stronger with every step forward. Jalen, with quiet strength, stepping to the front of the stage, his voice steady but emotional. I didn't speak up because I wanted people to like me. I didn't speak up for attention or applause. I spoke up because I know what it feels like to be overlooked, to be judged not by my actions, but by the color of my skin. And that's not okay. No one should have to feel like they're invisible. A hush falls over the room. Jalen takes a deep breath, his words carrying the weight of his experience, his father's lessons, and the future he now believes is possible. Jalen, with growing conviction, but I'm here to tell you that we can change this. We can make this school a place where no one has to hide who they are, where everyone has a voice. And it starts with us, every single one of us, looking inside and asking ourselves, what can we do to make sure that no one is left behind? The crowd is silent for a moment, processing the depth of Jalen's words. Then, as if on cue, applause erupts, louder this time. Jalen stands tall, his back straight, his heart full. He feels a surge of empowerment coursing through him. He's no longer just a student at this school. He's a leader. After the assembly, Jalen's life begins to change in small but significant ways. His teachers, including those who once overlooked him, now treat him with a newfound respect. They take his ideas seriously, and when he speaks up in class, they listen. Even Mrs. Peters, though her pride is still bruised, begins to treat him differently. She avoids making excuses for her past behavior, but there's a quiet acknowledgement in her actions. The school administration, spurred by the change in atmosphere, announces a new initiative to combat racial biases, offering workshops and discussions for both students and faculty. Jalen's father, Mr. Mitchell, sees the transformation in his son. One evening, as they sit together on the porch, he watches Jalen, who is now more comfortable in his skin than ever before. Mr. Mitchell, with pride, leaning back in his chair, "You did more than I ever could have hoped for, son. You took your pain and turned it into something powerful, something that's going to change the way people see the world." Jalen, reflectively with a small smile, "I didn't do it alone. There's still a lot of work to do. But I know now that I don't have to carry this weight by myself." Mr. Mitchell nods, his eyes softening with love and pride. He pulls Jalen into a brief hug, the kind that speaks more than words ever could. Mr. Mitchell with a chuckle, "You're stronger than you realize, Jalen. I knew you had it in you. I always knew." Jalen smiles, his heart swelling with gratitude. He's not just his father's son anymore. He's become his own man, someone who stands firm in his identity, his power, and his place in the world. In the weeks that follow, the school continues to change. The administration introduces new policies to address racial inequality, and students begin to openly discuss issues of privilege, bias, and inclusivity. Jalen's courage has set off a ripple effect that cannot be undone. One day, as Jalen walks through the hallways, a teacher who had once ignored him. As the weeks pass, Jalen begins to see the fruits of his efforts. The movement that started with a single voice has now gained momentum. Students and teachers alike are engaged in deep conversations about racism, privilege, and justice. The conversations are difficult, but necessary. Jalen's school, once a place where he felt isolated and alienated, has become a space of collective growth. It's not perfect, but it's changing. One day during lunch, a group of students approaches Jalen. He recognizes them as those who once stood on the sidelines, either too afraid or too indifferent to speak up. Now they are eager to listen, to understand, to be part of the change. Student 1, tentatively but with respect. "Jalen, we just wanted to say, we see you. We see what you've done, and we want to be better. We don't want to stay silent anymore. We want to learn how to stand up, too." Jalen looks at them, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He's not a hero. He's just a young man who decided that enough was enough, but he understands the gravity of what's happening now. This is more than just about him. It's about all of them. Jalen, nodding. "We're all in this together, but it takes more than words. It takes action. It takes making sure no one feels invisible. It takes standing up for the people who don't have the strength to stand up for themselves yet." The students nod, determined to carry the torch forward. As the school year progresses, Jalen's story continues to resonate with his peers. He's invited to speak at school board meetings, to share his experiences, and offer insight into how they can make their school a more inclusive place. The administration, initially hesitant, begins to actively support the students' efforts, providing resources for continued dialogue and action. One morning, Jalen walks into class to find that Mrs. Peters, though still distant, has begun to treat him with a newfound respect. She greets him with a simple nod, acknowledging his place in the classroom without the usual condescension. The silence between them speaks volumes. Jalen knows that things will never be the same. Not just for him, but for all the students who had suffered under the weight of prejudice. Jalen's parents continue to support him through every step of his journey. Mr. Mitchell, ever the guiding force, reminds Jalen of the importance of knowing one's worth. Together, they celebrate the small victories. But Jalen knows the work isn't done. He still faces challenges. His identity will always be scrutinized, and he will never be fully free from the bias that exists in the world. But for the first time, Jalen is at peace with himself. One evening, as Jalen sits at the dinner table with his father, he looks up at him with a soft yet determined expression. Jalen, thoughtfully, "You were right, Dad. I thought standing up would be the hardest part, but I see now that the hardest part is making sure this doesn't just fade away. It's not just about me. It's about making sure that everyone who feels invisible has a voice." Mr. Mitchell smiles warmly, pride shining in his eyes. Mr. Mitchell, calmly, with a knowing smile. "You're not just my son, Jalen. You're a force. You've got a gift, and the world is going to see it. Keep your head up. Keep pushing forward. This fight, it's not just yours anymore." Jalen nods, a sense of purpose settling in his heart. He knows that the road ahead will still have its challenges, but he also knows that he is no longer alone. He's part of something larger than himself, a movement for change, for justice, for equality. The school year comes to a close, but Jalen's journey has only just begun. His academic achievements are recognized at the graduation ceremony, but it's not the diploma he's most proud of. It's the impact he's made, the voices he's inspired, the seeds of change he's planted. As Jalen walks across the stage to receive his award, the crowd erupts into applause. But it's not just for his academic success. It's for his resilience, his bravery, his unwavering commitment to justice. In that moment, Jalen realizes that he's more than just a student. He's a leader. And as he walks off the stage, he doesn't feel the weight of the world on his shoulders anymore. Instead, he feels the strength of a community standing beside him, ready to rise together and fight for what's right. The final shot is of Jalen walking through the school halls, his head held high. He knows now, more than ever, that his voice has the power to inspire change. And with that knowledge, he steps boldly into the future, knowing that the journey ahead is not just about him, but about the collective effort to create a world where justice, equality, and dignity are within reach for all.